There is a big problem in Hearthstone right now. Big decks like Big Priest and Big Rogue are quickly becoming the most tilting decks in the entire format. There are a lot of big minions that we could easily talk about, but there is one particular legendary that I feel like must be addressed. Because it is extremely funny to me that when this card was released, almost everybody said that this card would not see competitive play of any kind. And well, here we are sitting in August, a couple of months after this card was released, and it's already becoming game-breaking within the wild format. I'm of course talking about Neptulon the Tidehunter. Why exactly is this card a problem? That's right, you can play this insane 10 mana legendary as early as turn 1 thanks to the new deck that has become extremely popular in Wild, Big Rogue. This deck is no longer a meme that only Dane Hearth can get away with playing now. There are several builds that are literally just geared to either summoning a bunch of Neptulons or summoning a bunch of Stoneborn Generals. And needless to say, this kind of deck immediately leads to the most uninteractive gameplay possible within the game. It's one thing to be OTK'd by a deck that isn't all too common, but when you see big decks, you're either going to automatically destroy them or you're going to get scammed very easily. There's almost no in-between with these kind of decks. But the main focus of today's video is going to be all about Neptulon the Tidehunter, especially with its interactions in Big Priest. Because one of the biggest problems that I have with this card is when you have multiple copies of Neptulon that are possible. The reason why Neptulon is particularly a problem in Priest and in Priest alone is because of the many different cards that Priest has to generate copies without any trouble. And when you have multiple copies of Neptulon or even the appendages of Neptulon, things get toxic very quickly.
Feeble prawns!
This kind of interaction is absolutely busted because it means that no part of Neptulon is safe to keep onto the field. So you have to remove every single minion, the 7/7s and the 4/2s. Meaning that if you have 6 Neptulon hands and 1 Neptulon, well, that 1 Neptulon is going to immediately swing those 6 hands into whatever you're attacking. So if you're attacking the face, that is 24 damage that you can swing twice. And when you can literally play this card as early as turn 1 in some situations, how is any deck supposed to be able to compete with that? On the other side of the fence, there are the decks that can beat the big decks. Any deck that has Lotheb is automatically going to be the bane of any Priest player's existence. And when I was trying to get clips with this deck, the first 2 games were immediately decks that could repeat the Lotheb battle cry. So this goes back to the uninteractiveness that these kind of decks can lead to, because you as the Priest player either don't get to play a game of Hearthstone, or your opponent literally doesn't get to have any kind of board interactions for the rest of the game if you do happen to pop off your high roll. Big Priest has gotten to the point where Blood of G'huun is only a 1-of in the deck because of how powerful Neptulon truly is. Blood of G'huun, the card that can easily build up an unkillable board that was already the go-to for Priest before Neptulon was added into the collection. The issue that I have with Big Priest is the lack of interactivity on both sides of the board. While with Big Rogue, I tend to have more of an issue with the possibility of its high rolls. Players in Top Legend are still trying to figure out the best version of this deck, or if this deck is even better than the Pillager Rogue decks that were already stomping the ladder beforehand. There are some players that are straight up taking Neptulon out of Big Rogue, but that's because Rogue doesn't have a lot of ways of being able to generate multiple copies unless they get a high roll with Snowfall Graveyard. But since players are still currently invested in trying to make the new cards work, there's been one particular list that has been able to rise with only using Stoneborn General as the main win con. You also do have Masked Reveler in order to really help bring out this kind of scam, but the main win con of this deck is going to be the 8/8s being summoned as quickly as turn 3. While playing Big Priest, I pretty much lost to any deck that was playing for tempo, and I lost any game to where I couldn't hit Illuminate into Shadow Essence. Unfortunately, with any of my games with Priest, I was not able to find any slow decks or any combo decks to where I could potentially cheat out the game as early as turn 5. So Big Priest does have its weaknesses, but I do believe that the gameplay experiences that this deck produces outweigh the consistency of how we can kill Big Priest. But when I was playing Big Rogue, it felt almost impossible to lose with this deck because of how quickly you're encouraged to pop off your combos. Cards like Prep, Counterfeit Coin, and to a lesser extent, Blackwater Cutlass also give you an insane amount of mana cheating available in the early game. And we all know the capabilities of what Snowfall Graveyard can do with cheap Death Rattles. When playing Big Rogue, I was able to get 3 wins in less than 5 minutes. I was able to get a turn 1 win. No, not with Neptulon. Just a classic turn 1 concede because people are already conceding as soon as they see rogues. A warrior conceded against me on turn 2 because I was able to cheat out a Stoneborn General by that turn. And I was barely able to clutch out a victory against Quest Hunter just because I had a little bit of luck. And there have already been players that have hit top 10 legend in the wild format with this archetype. And if this is going to be the typical gameplay experience that we come to expect whenever we go up against a big archetype, I don't know how many players are going to be able to stand this being meta relevant any longer. We know there are going to be nerfs and potential buffs that are going to happen after the Masters Tour. So here's how I would fix these decks if I was a Hearthstone game designer. Let's first take a look at Big Rogue, because I believe that this is one of the decks that is for sure going to get nerfed after we finally get the balance patches. The most obvious change you can make to this deck is by making Kobold Illusionist into a 5 mana card. This way, you can't cheat out the Death Rattle value with cards like Sketchy Information and Prep. However, I do believe that if we nerf Kobold Illusionist to a 5 mana minion, it's going to absolutely kill the deck to the point where it's going to be a meme deck that only Dane can utilize again. So is there any other nerf that we can do that doesn't just straight up kill this archetype, but actually brings it back a peg or two? Nerfing Sketchy Information to a 4 mana card could potentially slow down this deck so you don't just automatically win with Prep. But I feel like if decks have Coin and Prep, they're still going to do this around the same time. And all this nerf really does is just make Sketchy Information that much worse in Standard. Rogue in Standard is sitting in a very weird purgatory of sorts where it's not really good, but it's not exactly as terrible as some of the other classes that are existent. So nerfing any more of their cards is just going to delete the class in another format. And the same thing could also be argued for Snowfall Graveyard, which I feel like is going to be the nerf that Rogue is going to receive if any more Death Rattle packages become that much more problematic. Doubling up Death Rattles is one of the easiest way that this deck can scam games. So I feel like if there's going to be any of these cards changed, it's going to be Snowfall Graveyard. You can make a case to also nerf Neptulon, but I'm going to save my thoughts for him after we go through the Priest cards. Because Big Priest is in a little bit of a more peculiar situation when it comes to actually nerfing this class. When looking at all the Priest cards, there was only a couple cards that really stood out to me as being problematic. Those cards would be Illuminate, Palm Reading, Shadow Essence, as well as Neptulon. Illuminate sets up for the insane high rolls of this deck just being able to win as early as turn 2. If you Illuminate on the first turn, hit a Shadow Essence, and you already have Coin, you could play Shadow Essence into a turn 2 Neptulon or a Gahoon. And since you're playing Priest, the minion dying really doesn't matter because you have several ways of being able to bring it back. So this scam is just one of the most unfair ways that I can imagine losing in Wild right now. But again, if we nerf Illuminate, all this does is make Priest worse in the Standard format. You can make Illuminate into a 1 mana card, you can make Illuminate only discount 2 mana, but regardless, I still don't think this is the way that we should nerf this deck. You can nerf Palm Reading to 4 mana, but it really doesn't solve why this deck is problematic. But it's not on the same extent as Illuminate to the point where you can play a turn 2 big minion. Palm Reading does give you the access of being able to play Shadow Essence on turn 4 if you do have Coin, but there are some decks that already have damn near killed you by turn 4. And if we decide to nerf Shadow Essence to 7 mana, I think that just absolutely kills the Big Priest archetype, because this deck is extremely reliant on being able to get the Shadow Essence value as quickly as possible. Shadow Essence is such a difficult card to judge because if we make it 5 mana, the card is absolutely busted. If we make it 7 mana, the card is absolutely unplayable. So keeping it at 6 might just have to be the play, because we don't want this archetype to be completely dead unless it is one of the only meta-relevant decks that you'll be seeing on your climb. And this isn't the case. And this is one of the issues that I really have with trying to nerf Priest in general, because Big Priest is already somewhat struggling against some of the other decks that you will see on your ladder climb. You may scam more games than you end up losing, but the issue that I'm having here with Priest is that Neptulon is really the biggest problem of this deck. So how exactly do we nerf Neptulon in both Rogue and in Priest that doesn't make this card absolutely unplayable in other classes? One thing you could potentially do to Neptulon is to change the attack of his hands to 3/2 minions. Although I don't think this really solves the problem of Neptulon being able to attack with the other appendages that can be summoned. This may be extremely hard to program, but one thing I would love to see is the original copy of Neptulon controlling the original hands that he summoned. So if you end up summoning extra copies, they don't get to attack just because you already have a Neptulon the Tidehunter on the field. He should just be able to attack with 2 of his hands, and that's it. It makes sense for the card, right? Neptulon is supposed to be this gigantic minion attacking with 2 gigantic hands. So why is it that just because other copies of his hands are on the field, that he can also get to attack with them? Maybe there's some backstory to Neptulon the Tidehunter that I'm not familiar with, because I actually do not know much about the World of Warcraft universe. But in terms of balance and in terms of like a card game making sense, I think Neptulon should only attack with the 2 hands that he has summoned. And if you want to go so far to make it to where if a hand dies and one gets resurrected, he can still just attack with the 2 different copies of the hands, because they do have different artworks. But the only other option to this card is just to straight up nuke it from the format, and I don't really want to see this happen. At the beginning of an expansion, the wild format can easily fall victim to one deck absolutely dominating everything. This is why cards like Stealer Souls and the Warlock Quest were immediately banned from the format, because it was almost impossible to beat this deck with any known archetype. And I don't necessarily believe that Neptulon is this all-powerful card that we have to nuke from the format. It's really only problematic in these 2 decks that we're seeing. Big Priest has been a thing for years, so I don't imagine that they're going to nerf Shadow Essence to a 7 mana card or anything else like that. I really do believe that they're just going to have to deal with what Neptulon can do in the format. And honestly, my suggestion to nerf Neptulon really only does limit what it can do in these big decks, because there's not a lot of decks that can summon extra copies of Neptulon. Maybe a hunter can get lucky with escaping maneuvers. Maybe a shaman can somehow play criminal lineup on Neptulon in order to copy the extra hands. But I really don't believe that Neptulon is that powerful in other classes to the point where we need to nuke him from the wild format. So if there's going to be any changes to Neptulon, I really hope that he can only attack with the hands that he summons, or just the 2 different copies of the hands attacking. Overall, my biggest problem with big decks is the lack of interactivity, especially with Big Priest. I would make the argument that Big Rogue is a lot more fun than Big Priest, but that's for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's the new hotness of this meta, and it's playing a lot of the new cards that we wanted to see play. And it's also actively doing things in its early and mid game to where it's not just hoping to play Shadow Essence as early as possible. So there are some ways that this Rogue deck can feel like a legitimate Hearthstone deck because it has lots of options available. But this still doesn't stop the insane turn 2 concedes, turn 3 concedes that you definitely will experience if you go up against this deck. These kind of scams are way too efficient and way too consistent to see every other game in Wild. And both of these decks were able to make it to the top legend ranks of the format. So you're definitely going to be seeing them on your legend climb if you decide to play the wild format. But overall, I really do believe that Neptulon is not necessarily the cause of a lot of these decks being insane, but it's the reason why a lot of these decks are winning. These style of decks can easily make a player feel like their choices just don't matter at the end of the day. And wild may be wild, but I would like my choices to matter a little bit, and I would like for Neptulon to stop hitting me for over 40 damage just because I left the 7/7 alive. And if I'm being honest, I'm just really sad that big rogues don't play the biggest minion in the game. But feel free to let me know what you guys would like to see changed in the wild format. Leave a comment down below to let me know what you think of these changes and if you think any other cards should be nerfed. I'd love to have a conversation with you guys regarding the wild format. I hope you guys enjoyed this big take on big decks in Hearthstone, and we'll see you for the next video.